Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off the last time. This is the second perspective, and again, perspectives are a different way and of looking at terrorists, or from a different standpoint or viewpoint, different ways that we study terrorist and terrorism. So we spoke about the terrorist, the supporter, the victim, the target, the onlooker, and the analyst, and now we'll get into it a little bit more. Okay, so the terrorist is obviously the perpetrator of the violence, which sends a positive message to supporters and attempts to intimidate opponents. And so there are different kinds of supporters. Supporters could be material supporters, they could be moral supporters, they could be philosophical supporters, um, or they can be sympathizers, which are not necessarily supporters, but people that sympathize with the cause. Material supporters sometimes are folks that um, send send money, funds, funding to a group, and ostensibly sometimes a group. They don't advertise that they're a terrorist organization. They advertise as different types of organizations in order to drum up funds, and people inadvertently sometimes fund them, sometimes knowingly fund them. But obviously, terrorist groups and terrorist organizations need funding in order to operate. So they derive their funding in different ways. It could be through criminal activity, it could be through legitimate fundraising. There are many ways in which terrorists are able to support their cause. So the supporter are those who aid the terrorists with information, distribution of finances, etc. They're also an audience that is positively appealed to by the terrorist. Um, we've all heard rumors and speculation about, or when, and sometimes it's not speculation, but when an attack occurs, there are people that cheer the terrorists on if they're successful. So these are the supporters of the terrorist. And again, it could be financially, it could be morally, or it could be philosophically. It could be somebody that agrees with them philosophically. They don't have to, you know, they don't have to send the money, but they agree with their cause, and so philosophically, they are able to support the terrorist in that way. Okay, so the victims may be innocent collateral damage, as they call it, but they may also be judged as benefiting from a larger injustice. In other words, when Timothy McVeigh put the parked a truck van in front of the Murrah Building in Oklahoma City, he knew that that was a government building that contained government employees, and they also believe and they know that he knew that there was a daycare center also operating in the building that um, took care of the children of the employees that worked there. So those children were collateral damage, and the people that worked in the building, the government employees, were actually they were targets. The building was a target. Government employees were targeted, and the innocent civilians just happened to be there were collateral damage. So oftentimes terrorists will plant a bomb or a device or an attack, and it purposefully attack a government building, and because those people represent the government or work for the government. But oftentimes they'll plant a device or a bomb in a subway or in a train station, like has happened in London and in Paris and in Spain, and just inadvertently kill innocent people who happen to just be there in the wrong place in the wrong time. And so those innocents become the victims of the terrorist in order to, um, you know, gain a larger audience, or to get their message across, whatever message that they're trying to convey. Okay, so the target is very important. The people of the property are attacked for symbolic purposes, and the attack sends a broader message to the enemy society. So terrorists in the past in the United States have tended to try and attempt to attack iconic figures and iconic targets, such as the World Trade Centers, which represented world trade, the Statue of Liberty. It has been looked upon as a target. The Empire State Building, and the Empire State Building had a terrorist attack. A terrorist incident several years ago. And so some of these buildings, um, they look to attack because the vulnerability and being vulnerable is what the terrorists try to exploit. Like, hey, you know, society can't even keep these places safe, and if they're not safe, no place is safe. So um, this is part of the mindset of the terrorist is trying to do: make people afraid and invoke fear, so that maybe they won't go to Times Square on New Year's Eve night, or maybe they won't go to the Empire State Building, to the observation deck. And so this is the kind of fear that terrorists look to exploit in their targets. And oftentimes now today we hear about soft targets. And soft targets are important because these are the places that in recent weeks, months, and in the past several years, that active shooters have found to be vulnerable. And so, such as malls, nightclubs, places like that, where there are a lot of people, and the people that are there are vulnerable to a terrorist attack. So the onlooker is the person that's observing the attack through the media, and so the media is an important it's an important part of the terrorist environment, because the terrorist also looks to exploit the media and looks for full coverage. And in today's day and age, with social media and the media itself, the media cycle, the news cycle, it's a 24-hour news cycle. So when something happens, there's breaking news on CNN, on Al Jazeera, on CSNBC, NBC. There's 24-hour coverage. So um, terrorists know that, and they look to exploit it and get their attacks as much publicity as they can. And through the publicity, that's how they attract followers. And so the attack could either be viewed as positively or negatively. And positively, again, it's viewed positively by the supporters, the people that are sympathizers or supporters of that particular group. So the analyst, those are the political leaders, the experts in their hire, and the academics who all interpret the attack and its causes and impacts. So the analyst can make sense of a sometimes confusing situation, and usually rely on the media to have their perspectives known. So whenever there's an attack, or an event, or an event is coming, if you watch NBC or CBS, generally they hire the same analysts to come on their shows. They're kind of like, in quotations, I guess, talking heads, and they come on and they try to make sense of the event that happened, or try to make sense of what's possibly going to occur. Excuse me, why there's a buildup of security at Times Square, and so the talking heads get on TV. Excuse me again, and they uh, explain why there are sanitation trucks parked at every corner, and the new NYPD is not allowing traffic through the cross streets. Well, because there was a terrorist attack in Paris, and the NYPD studied that attack and came to the realization that, hey, um, large trucks driven through crowds can be a deadly weapon, as experienced in Paris. So these folks get on TV, and they some of them are former law enforcement, some of them are former academics, some of them worked for different corporations. Um, Bruce Hoffman, he's a noted expert on terrorism. He worked for the Rand Corporation. He's written several books. Um, and so you'll see Bruce Hoffman oftentimes on TV giving his opinion about a particular incident that has occurred, or the plan, or the um, planning for an incident that we're planning for, that is possibly could occur. In the previous slide, I mentioned Bruce Hoffman, and he was an expert in the field of terrorism, and one of the few experts there was prior to September 11th. In 1998, he wrote the book Inside Terrorism, and it became a seminal work. It's still one of the most cited works about terrorism that there is. It's been updated, but Mr. Hoffman was on the forefront of enlightening people to um, the oncoming and the dangers of Al Qaeda as they were emerging as an international terrorist organization and power. So terrorists and their supporters. This is the third perspective, and it's whether we're terrorists or freedom fighters. And so terrorists develop a language and imagery that laud themselves as freedom fighters. Again, being a terrorist is a pejorative term, and so being a freedom fighter evinces um, more positive connotation. And so they look to promote that they're freedom fighters in order to gain support. So support is crucial because support could mean um, public opinion, the support of public opinion, but it also could mean funding. And it's important um, to not be known as a terrorist. Now, the Irish Republican Army, the Provisional IRA in Northern Ireland, it was very important to them to promote themselves as freedom fighters, trying to rid the country of British occupation in Ireland. So a lot of the support that they got monetarily came from people in the United States. Irish Americans were one of the main sources of income and support for the Irish Republican Army during their heyday when they were the most active. Now, again, whether people here, when they made donations to different groups, did they know that it might be funneled into the IRA? But probably not. But the IRA was able to promote the message that the Irish under British rule were being discriminated against and that they were being treated as second class citizens. So they were able to gain support from the United States because of that narrative. And so they were able to generate a substantial amount of monetary funds um, sent over to the country. So Sinn Féin was the political party that was once affiliated with the IRA, and they maintained that the Republican terrorists were fighting for independence from the United Kingdom for the ultimate purpose of reunification with the Republic of Ireland. So um, it was through that narrative, again, that they were able to generate substantial amounts of funds. The Tamil Tigers at one time announced they were fighting for their own identity, rooted in their historically given homeland. Um, so different groups, and the Tigers again were in Sri Lanka, and so these different groups sometimes um, they're able to promote their cause outside of their own country and are able to have sympathizers, maybe of their own nationality, that live in other countries that will send funding back or through different organizations. And through these different organizations, the money winds up being sent um, overtly or covertly into the group's possession. So there's a debate over whether the use of political violence is justifiable. Some folks believe that um, violence in order to rid a country of an illegal occupation or a group or a government that is um, occupying a country and is um, unfair to the people, then they say that political violence is a necessary cause and it's justifiable to rid the country of that occupation. So governments and dissidents always cite noble causes and aspirations to justify their violence. Um, so it's a debate that has gone on for a long time and will probably go on forever. Sometimes when a government is oppressive, it's difficult for the outside world to see if there is terrorists or dissidents or dissident activity occurring in that particular country. Some countries don't have freedom of the press. Dissidents are jailed or summarily executed. So there's places like this in the world, and so depending on the government, some governments we do have a narrative back and forth, and we're able to ascertain whether political violence is occurring. In North Korea, for example, if political violence were occurring, or in parts of China or in China, the outside world might not even be aware that there was a dissident population in the country, because the country is so oppressive, and if there isn't freedom of the press, so it's difficult sometimes to um, ascertain whether there are groups operating within the borders of some countries. So perspective 4 is extremism or mainstreamism. Is political terrorism a fringe phenomenon to be rejected as exceeding acceptable limits, or should it be seen as a rational choice by mainstream elements in a society? Well, so let's look, for instance, at Dr. Vlasic, the animal rights advocate that we saw on the 60 Minutes video. Is it a rational choice of his to um, promote extremism or to promote terrorism in order to get people to stop eating meat? Dr. Vlasic is a speciesist. He believes that all species are equal and that no species has a right to um, subjugate another one and turn it into dinner or lunch. So is he on the fringe? And as an extremist, is terrorism the only choice that he has in order to change people's mind? Think about it. It's gonna be part of our discussion question for this week. So in the book, Martin talks about the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. Recently they have signed a treaty with the Colombian government to end hostilities against each other. But in the past, FARC believed and said that the Colombian government was extremely savage in their destruction of the group. So they met fire with fire, and they were equally as savage um, when they attacked civilian and government targets. And so the question is it justified because one side is using extreme violence? Is it justifiable for the other side to meet with the same extreme violence um, that the other side attacked with? I mean, is it justified? Does one um, allow for the other to occur? And again, governments commonly claim the threat posed by dissidents justifies what may be considered extreme measures. For example, Argentina's dirty war, and he talks about it in the book, which saw about 30,000 people disappear as part of the government crackdown on opponents in the 1970s and 80s. So oftentimes, and sometimes it's through subjugates, that governments will make dissidents disappear. Dissidents are people that speak out against the government. So, um, and governments justify it through that these groups um, they are dangerous, and so because they are so dangerous and that they might overthrow the government, they use extreme measures to put down the resistance. Again, and one of the questions that that is asked is do some political environments make extremism justifiable within the mainstream? And again, in certain places, in certain countries, um, where the government has been so oppressive that um, revolutions occur. But prior to the revolutions, oftentimes before the revolution can gain ground, oftentimes terrorist activity occurs first, and it slowly builds into a revolution. And so, in that case, if there's an oppressive government, such as, say, for instance, maybe in Iran in 1978-79, the Shah of Iran. He ruled with an iron fist, and he was very oppressive, and the result was a revolution by a sectarian people, and it is now a um, Islamic country. It's run by a religious group, so it went from being a secular country to a sectarian. And so um, sometimes when there's so much oppression, little pockets of terrorism begin to occur, groups spawn up, and eventually sometimes a revolution occurs. So it's a difficult question to answer because sometimes when we start out as a terrorist campaign, sometimes innocent lives are lost, as opposed to when it becomes a revolution and the dissidents are fighting up against the government and the army. Okay, so terrorism focuses our attention on the relationship between the quality of force employed and the characteristics of the intended target. Um, so, combatants, non combatants, and the use of force. So, combatants are generally the military or paramilitary folks in the country, and non combatants are generally the civilian groups. Um, the lines between them may become blurred in times of upheaval. Non-combatants and combatants, there's also a legal connotation that goes along with that, and we may talk about it a little bit later on in the semester. But a combatant, when they're captured, they are entitled to the Geneva Convention as prisoners of war, whereas a non-combatant, when they're captured, they are not entitled to the same um, rights as someone who is generally a member of an army. So that terminology was used when the people were first captured, the terrorists or the non-combatants were captured in Afghanistan and sent to the various places around the country where we house prisoners. So again, later on in the chapter, well, I'm sorry, in the course, we'll talk a little bit about non-combatants and combatants. So the discriminate and indiscriminate use of force. The discriminate use of force, um, for example, could be when the president orders a drone strike on a uh, suspected terrorist in a region, say in Afghanistan, and so it's kind of a surgical strike where we look to take out that individual um, without harming, hopefully, innocent civilians around him. The indiscriminate use of force was widely used, and it is widely used during war times, and it was used extensively during World War II, for instance, when the Germans bombed the British at night, or when the United States or Britain bombed the Germans. And when we did these bombing raids, generally, who was ever it included military, civilian, whoever was in the area where we were bombing, actually fell victim. The same thing when the Germans bombed Britain. They didn't look to bomb just military targets. They bombed um, anybody and buildings throughout the country. Um, we bombed Germany and basically we annihilated the city of Dresden. So total war is when a country uses the indiscriminate force and justifies it as a way to end the war and to gain a political advantage. So, in conclusion of chapter 2, I would have you look at page 40 and the political violence matrix. And in the matrix, he talks about combatants and non combatants, the use of discriminate or indiscriminate force, and violent, violent environments resulting from the use of force. And he has a table there in which he goes over several different um, parts of the matrix. So that wraps up chapter 2. So we will move on from here to chapter 3. Um, make sure you look at the discussion board. Enjoy the week, and thank you for tuning in.